Hello world, it's Nginx. Now in our series of 9 days of DevOps, today we are going to be talking on the concept of web servers. Now I have previously made a video on tackling the project or the tasks related to web servers, but in this particular session, or in this particular video rather, I'll be diving in extensively on the concept of web server and understanding Nginx as a web server. Okay, so quickly let's get ourselves acquainted with the term web servers. Now, when we talk about web server, we are basically talking about a software that actually resides on a machine that is able to serve out, or that is able to respond to clients with documents. Now, when you go to your browser and you kind of type in www.samikings.com.ng, now there is a web server there that is actually going to serve you some pages. That means when you make a request now to www.samikings.com.ng, there is a server that is actually going to respond to you with a content. Now, by convention, or the way web server actually work, web server only respond with static files like your HTML, like things that doesn't change, things that are not dynamic. Now, we should not confuse web servers with our web browser. Now, first things first, server actually work with a client server model. Now, when you talk about the web server, which resides on the server, now it shouldn't be confused with your web browser. Now, your web browser is an application that resides on the client machine that makes a request to the server. So in using the same example, when I make a request from my mobile phone using Google Chrome now, which acts as my web browser, it makes a request to the server hosting the pages in which samikings.com.ng is, and that server responds to the web browser with the static files, and the web browser is being configured to display that static files to us. Now, I'm just going to stop there. If you really want if you really want an in-depth understanding about how we actually get to see pages, then I think you should go into studying about DNS and DNS HTTP request and all that. Okay, so now in this tutorial, we are now exposed to Nginx as a web server. Now, aside Nginx, there are other web servers available. Now, you have Apache, you have Nginx, you have Lightspeed. However, we are now choosing Nginx to be our web server. Yes, we are choosing Nginx to be our web server, although Nginx can also serve multiple purposes. Nginx can actually serve as a reverse proxy. Nginx can actually serve as a load balancer. Nginx can also serve as a mail server. So depending on what you actually want to use Nginx for, you could actually use it for. But the reason why we're actually choosing Nginx is the fact that Nginx has the capacity to handle multiple requests. Like, it has a high performance score than Apache. So most times you often go down the route of Nginx. Okay, so now let's start with installing Nginx. So first things first, I'll actually log into my server using server 2, because on my server 1 I already have Nginx installed from our SSH tags we did in day 1. I actually installed Nginx there. So I'm just going to connect to my server 2 using this script that I actually created to make things easy for me. And yeah, I'm on server 2. Now, if I do this call localhost, now you can see it told me failed to connect to localhost port 80, connection refused. Now, what is actually happening? It's still the same architecture now. Now, in case you have not noticed, call is actually your web browser, or it's actually a client agent. When talking about user agents now, curl is actually, you can actually look at this as your own Google Chrome. Now when curl tries to make a request to this my server, now it's saying that okay, this particular port 80 is actually, like this particular port 80, it fails to connect because it's closed. That means on this my machine here, I am not currently accepting any connection via that port. Now why is it actually going through port 80? Because by default curl is actually going to make connections via port 80. Now you can actually specify your port that you actually want to call to by using the p flag, but let's just keep things cool and let's just keep things simple. So right off from here, you can see that currently port 80 is closed. That means on this my machine in which I actually want to use as a web server, this particular port 80 is closed. Now by default connection by default web browsers is actually going to connect to port 80 and port 443. Port 80 is the unsecured HTTP connection, while port 443 is the secured HTTP connection, which we now call HTTPS. The S they're just saying is an additional layer of security, which is your SSL certificate there. Okay, let's just also keep things simple. So now it's just still, though we want to use this as our web server, this is just basically like a machine now, or like your local workstation there. Now to convert this particular machine to be a server, we'll need to install a web server application on this my particular machine that will now convert this my machine from just a regular machine to be a server that when a web browser makes a request to it, it actually responds with something. Now, like I said earlier, in this case, we're actually going to be installing Nginx. Okay, now you could actually check if Nginx is present on your local machine. That's if you're actually using Ubuntu system. You could actually do this by using the app list. Then I don't really want to see everything. I just want to look for a particular one called Nginx. As such, I am piping this to my grep command and I'm only specifying that I'm grepping for this particular word here called Nginx. Okay, and you can see I currently have Nginx installed. So it therefore means that I could actually go as well as installing Nginx using I have to proceed this with sudo apps install then y for yes and Nginx, meaning I could actually do this, right? But now there are two ways you could actually install Nginx. Now you could actually install Nginx from your application manager, that's if you're using Ubuntu using apt, and you can also install Nginx from the official Nginx repository on GitHub. Now depending on the way you install Nginx determines the configuration structure in which you will have on your machine. Now when you install Nginx from the Nginx repository, that's from GitHub, Nginx actually creates a user called Nginx. While installing it, it creates a user called Nginx, and your site's available and your site's enabled. It's not actually included. I'm saying this because yes, I have done it back then when I was actually doing this particular project in ALX. I actually compared the two and I saw that yes, this is the difference. So when you actually install Nginx from the GitHub repository, Nginx creates, during the installation process, it creates a user called Nginx, and then those your directories called site available and site enabled are not included. However, when you install Nginx using this, of which I'm assuming this is what you're going to be using to install Nginx, Nginx creates a user called www-data, and also you get on your Nginx file structure, which we are going to be seeing shortly, you also see your site available and your site enabled. Now what this two folder does, we're actually going to be seeing that, and we will be explaining it to ourselves. So now that is out of the way, let's now install Nginx. So to install that, just actually run this on your terminal. And I also want to encourage us to not just watch this video, but also practicalize this. We learn by doing. That is the way software engineering works. You learn things by actually doing it. Okay. And at this point in time, I also want to encourage us to drop a like, drop your questions on the comment section, turn on the notification bell, and do subscribe. And if you have friends that are actually undertaking the ALX course, particularly this particular project, and they are having challenge, feel free to share this video to them. All right, so pressing my enter, and yes, Nginx is currently being installed. Now you can see mine is pretty fast. Now this is actually dependent on your current internet connection. As you can see, mine is pretty fast, but yours might take a little time. Well, it depending on your internet network connection speed. Okay, now that Nginx is now installed, I'll clear that. Now I'm going to rerun this. Remember, now curl is my CLI based user agents, right, for making requests. Now I'm going to rerun this now, and then let's see if port 80 is now open, and then let's try to deduce what happens. And voila, previously we saw that when we ran this command, we got an error message. However, when we run this now, we see that this is the response we are getting. So it therefore means that automatically when you install Nginx, now during the process of installing Nginx, including the fact that it's also going to create a user called www-data, it's also going to open port 80, because previously port 80 was closed, and I said that by default call is actually going to use port 80 for connection, except we specify a port using the P flag, right? Okay, now since that is out of the way, it therefore means that when you install Nginx, by default Nginx is also going to start, and it's also going to open port 80 for connection. All right, because there are some applications in which you start by default, you only there are some applications in which you install by default, they don't start. You actually have to now manually start it up. Now in this case, it's different for Nginx. Once you install it, because we didn't actually run any command, we only ran the installation command, and automatically it's installed and it starts it up and opens it up, right? Okay, now I actually said that Nginx is actually going to create a user called www-data. Now one way you could actually see this is by looking at your /password d. Now this is the way it is. I'm just going to use my vi command etc. Now by looking at this particular file, now if we take a look at this particular file, now please note that the files underneath the etc directory are usually belonging to the root user. So if you're actually if you are not root, and currently I'm not root, you can see I'm user Ubuntu. So if I'm actually going to opening this, I'm only going to be opening it on read only due to the permissions. Now there's a way you can actually change the permissions of the etc directory. Well, let me just show you guys. Now to do that, you could actually do this like using the sudo command, then the chown, then you do this to user, and then you provide the directory or the file or whatever. So I'm just going to say for the etc directory. What this command will actually do will actually change the permissions of the files underneath the etc directory to be the current user, in this case, which is actually Ubuntu. Now, doing this will enable you actually make edits to whatever file that is existing in the etc directory without you actually typing in the sudo command before such command. But for me, I'm not going to be doing that. Well, run that command only when you know what you are doing, please and please, because we know that any edits you make on Linux by either deleting or whatever action you carry out on your Linux terminal, they are not reversible. So please and please know what you are doing. Thank you. Again, I would like to ask, if you're not subscribed, kindly hit on the subscribe button and turn on notification bell. So I'm going to bring back this command and then let's look at it. And then if you look through it, you can see that, yeah, there's actually a user -data, right? Okay, now to further reemphasize what we've said, now if you look at the current service that are, or the current process that are actually running by doing ps-aux-f, and then let's grep for Nginx, because we know that Nginx is currently running, right? Now let's see, sorry, I spelled Nginx wrongly there. Now let's see what user is currently running Nginx. Is it Ubuntu? Because it was actually we ran the installation command as root by using sudo whatever back there. Like, yeah, by running this, we see that we actually ran this command using the sudo privilege, meaning we are actually running this command as root. Now let's see if we actually do this, if Nginx is going to be running as Ubuntu or as root or as -data. Now let's see that. Now you could see, sorry, the content of this, the output actually wrapped to the next line there, but then you could see that the master process is actually running as root. However, the worker process is actually running as -data. Now we now have two concepts, master and worker, right? Okay, now this tells us that Nginx actually operates under the master-slave architecture. Now, what does the master process actually do? Now, the master process actually loads up your Nginx configuration files and then pushes those configuration files to the worker process. Now, what does the worker process do? The worker process is the one that is actually handling the connections, or that is actually processing the data. So when I actually ran this command here, call localhost, it was actually the worker process that accepted that connection and responded to me with this. Okay, we see we're actually diving deeper into the concept about Nginx, of which I didn't actually do while I was actually making the ALX review on web server project. I was the goal of that particular video there was to just tackle and explain the task, but the goal of this particular video now is to explain Nginx so that we can understand, because moving forward, some of the tasks you're actually going to be doing either via debugging or anything, I think, from your application project application server project, and so you actually be dealing with Nginx. So it is very necessary you actually get the basic knowledge about Nginx. And aside ALX, moving forward, we will actually have to interact with web servers, especially when you're a backend SE like me. All right, cool. Okay, now we've seen new things, worker and master. But then before we go in there, now let's see with the Nginx configuration file or the Nginx file system before we move to the configuration file. Remember, I said when you install Nginx from your application manager using apt, you actually get site available and site enabled, right? Okay, now so one way we could verify that is by looking at this and looking at the Nginx directory. Now, how do I know Nginx directory is currently there? Now, some of you might think that, right? Now, once you install a service or you install a package, now the configuration file is actually usually going to reside on the etc directory, basically where all your service configuration will basically lives in your Linux system. So therefore means that if you also install MySQL or Mongo or whatever, chances are 100% of the time the configuration file for that particular service resides on your etc directory. So probably when you are running some backup or some sort, yeah, etc directory is one directory in which you need to add to the backup. Okay, since that is out of the way, now let's look through this. And cool, we could now see this is it. We have the sites available, sites enabled, the nginx.conf and the conf.d. And yeah, we also have modules available, modules enabled, and all that. Now, what we're actually going to be concerned with for this particular video is the sites available, sites enabled, and the nginx.conf directory. Okay, all right, cool. Now, first things first, what does this nginx.conf directory, nginx.conf file actually means, right? Well, we could actually view this using read only, right, by not preceding this with sudo. So etc nginx, then nginx.conf. Now let's just see that. Now you can see I'm opening this in read only mode because I didn't use sudo, right? Okay, now you can see now the first directive which you have here is that user //, right? Meaning that, remember, we said our worker process is actually going to load the configurations file. So we are now saying that, okay, now we need to run this as what? The user //. Now the next step you are seeing here now, it becomes what? The worker processes, and by default it is set to auto. Now by convention, your worker process is actually the number of cores in which you have on your machine here. So if you have one core, yeah, you could actually come in here and put 1. But since we are actually setting this, since by default it's actually set to auto, it means that if we have 4 cores on our machine, Nginx, that means the number of worker processing which you are going to be having is 4. Now if you don't want that, let's say you have 4 cores and then you just only want Nginx to use 2 cores of that, well, you can now come here, change your auto to 2, and then you only have 2 cores. You only have 2 worker processes running. Now the next up here is actually stating the PID, right? Meaning what process ID Nginx is actually going to be using to run. Now this is actually going to get from this particular file here. Okay, all right, so if we close this up, or instead of closing this up, I think I could actually log into this same server. Yes, I think I actually log into this same server, and then we could do it side by side. Yeah. Okay, now if we look at this particular file in this directory, now let's do that. Let's say vi run, then nginx. Now if we look at this, we see that this is the process ID in which Nginx is actually going to run under. That means this is the process ID. And then if we have additional modules installed, sorry about that, sorry. Now if you have additional modules installed, we could see the very first thing the master process actually does. It's actually going to include all the modules enabled and their configuration files. Remember when we did this, Remember when we saw this directory here called modules enabled. So all the modules enabled on my current machine here is actually going to be loaded up, right? And then you have your events, HTTP, you have your events, you have your HTTP, and like so. All right, now before we proceed, when Nginx actually runs, the access log, right, meaning anytime any connection is being made to our machine, anytime anybody actually makes a connection to our machine, the connection actually going to be stored on our access logs, right? Access logs. Why? If Nginx generates an error, it's actually going to be stored in the error log in this particular directory here, var log Nginx. Okay. Now, one thing we actually now need to turn our attention to is this part here, meaning after loading everything up, is now going to load up the configurations on this particular on our conf.d, all files ending with a .conf, because we can see the wildcard there, and also is actually going to include all files currently existing on our site enabled, right? Okay, since that is out of the way, now let's turn our attention to our sites available. So now let's look at what's present on our sites available. So Nginx sites available, let's just see. Now you can see I only have a default file just called defaults, just a single file. Now let's look at what's actually present on our sites enabled. And then we can see this is a symbolic link. Now, how do I know it's a symbolic link? Well, because of the first instance, because of the colors. Also, you could actually do a long listing. You can use ls flagger, but I like using this as an alias. Now you can see that this default file is actually pointing to this file here. So it's a sim link, or is a symbolic link. So this particular file that is current here is actually pointing to this file here that is located in this directory. So now what does that tell us? It tells us that when Nginx loads up, it's actually going to look at the configuration files present in this particular directory. Now, it is advisable that you put all your configuration files in the sites available, and then you create a symlink from your site enabled to your site available, just as it is here by default. Now you can, when you are running Nginx as a virtual host, meaning different domains, let's say sammykings.tech, then sammykings.com.ng, then sammykings.com, you can see there are different domains. Now I could host those three domains still on the same server, and then with different configurations. So when I'm having such a setup, it's not really advisable for me to use defaults, right? So what is advisable is to create configuration files according to the domain name, and then you could proceed to the configuration. But because I'm not doing something like that, however, you might want to do something like that when you are kind of tackling your application server project. Yeah, I did something like that because I really did not want to kind of create a custom file all of it, so like from fresh again. So what I just did back then when I was kind of tackling when I was doing my application server project in the ALX SC program, what I just did was to create another file and call it sammykings.tech, and then I kind of started doing it from there. Okay, All right, so that's out of the way. Now let's look at what is available or what is inside our default file. So again, we'll be opening this using read only because we are not actually adding sudo to it like this. So okay, so etc nginx sites available, then default. Right, now let's open this. Now let's see. Okay, so now this is the default file that comes with Nginx. Now what are these directives actually talking about? Now first things first, also when you're trying to look at this, you need to understand what it means by a context, a directive, and a main context. Okay, now when you talk about a context, now a context can be a block context or a main context. Now when you talk about a context is one that actually has opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. Then inside it you have different directive inside it, meaning when you say you have a context is when you have multiple directive enclosed in opening and closing curly braces. Are we good? So server becomes a context. Now it is different from a main context. Now a main context is the one that it's not underneath any context. A good example of a main context is it's HTTP. This here that we saw is our HTTP context, in which we saw on our nginx.conf directory here, as well as the mail, the events, as well as the mail events HTTP. We could see here that events, HTTP, and mail, they are main context. However, server is just a context, meaning I could actually put server, this my configuration files, inside my HTTP context, because since we're actually going to be making a request via HTTP, so this HTTP block is going to be triggered as such. All communications that actually pertains to HTTP resides here. However, when we are using Nginx as a mail server, then we actually want to uncomment this part that talks about mail, and then all configuration or all connection that has to do with our mail server going to be reside here. And now take a quick look at this. You can see here that server is actually present here. So it re-emphasizes or it strengthens the understanding that though server is on the main context here, because it's not being housed by any other context. It's itself not a main context, because you cannot put server on its own inside this global configuration file. You can see it's actually being housed. So context like server, context like location, they are just context. However, main, HTTP, event, and like so, they are main context. So when you are using what, you should know when you are using it. Okay, so if you don't really want to go through this process, you could, although I don't advise that, you could actually come in here in your HTTP block and you create a server context, and then you put all that, because it's still going to load up. Remember, it's still going to load up. All right, okay, all right, perfect. Now, since that is out of the way, now let's come back to this point, and then let's look at now the first directive in which we have here is the listen directive. Now, what is this listen directive telling it? It's actually telling the web server that it should listen to a particular port that we specify. Now, the particular port that we have specified here is port 80. Now if you're actually going to also be listening to port 443, which is the secured HTTP connection, you actually want to still specify it here. Now we've specified that this particular port is our default server. Now this next particular block here is actually making room for connection via IPv6. Now there's actually what they call IPv6 and IPv4, right? So when any user is actually trying to connect to our machine or our web server using an IPv6 address, we still want to route them to the port 80. So we are saying port 80 when the first one is for IPv4, and when you are specifying a particular port for IPv6, you actually have to do something like this, which is particularly saying for IPv6. Now to some people, they might want to explicitly specify that this is for IPv6 only. You could decide to go down that route. Okay, now the next thing here we actually want to look at is the root directory. Now the root directory, we're actually passing var.html as our parameter. Now what does it tell us? Now whenever we make a request to our machine and we do not specify a particular resource, that means we do not do something like samikings.com.ng/blog. Now we are specifying that the particular resource in which we want to get is the blog. Now when we just specify samikings.com.ng without specifying the exact resource, first things first, we need to specify our root so that Nginx will know where it wants to start searching for content to display. Now by default, because we've not actually done anything yet, so by default when we install Nginx, the default root directory is var.html. Now on this other terminal here, which is pretty convenient, we could actually verify this by actually looking at the var.html, and then let's see. Wow, so first things first, it is existing, because if this directory is not existing, then to tell you directory does not exist. So definitely this HTML directory is existing, and then there is a file called nginx index.nginx-debian.html. Cool. So it tells us that once a request comes to our web server, Nginx is just going to go straight up to this particular directory, right? Now when a particular resource is not being specified, which now brings us to the concept of index. The index directory kicks in when we do not specify any particular resource. Like we make a request saying samikings.com.ng. Now we did not specify any particular resource, right? So what is going to happen is that Nginx is now going to look at all parameters that you actually specify here. So it's actually going to start with index.html, index.htm, and then end up with index.nginx-debian.html. All right, cool. Now you can see here there's an advice: add index.php to the list if you are using PHP. So when you're actually using PHP, you actually come here and put index.php. However, how is Nginx going to route this particular files here? It's actually going to route them doing from left to right, meaning it's first going to check for index.html. If it doesn't find that, it's going to check for index.htm. If it doesn't find out, it's then going to come here and do this, because by default Nginx actually coming when you install it, it's actually going to put this in there, because we've not done anything there. And we could see this particular part that is highlighted here is also present here. You could see it. So if that is true, it means that if I do this, right, so meaning that if I look into this particular file, I should see index. So if I look into this particular file, so you can see this is the this is the default file that is being saved to us, right? This is the default file. So if that is true, yes, let's test it out, right? Remember, code along with me, test things out yourself. So I could actually add my own file, right? So I'm just going to do sudo vi var var.html. Then let's make our own file called index.html. Let's make our own file called index.html. Now in this, press I for inserting mode. Let's just put in an HTML tag on h2 and then just say hello Sammy, and then let's close this h2 tag, and then let's save this. I'm going to use X to save because I don't want to write WQ. Now let's save this. Now note, because when Nginx started up, this was the configuration file Nginx actually loaded up. So even without us restarting Nginx, take note, even without us restarting Nginx or reloading the configuration file, now there are difference now restarting and reloading. Now instead of without us doing any of those actions, now if we run call localhost now, I think I have run this before. Oh, come on, I can't continue finding this. I'm just going to do call localhost. Now you can see what I have here now. What? Hello Sam. This further re-emphasizes what we've specified, that it's first going to check for index.html, because when we look at this now, we now see that we have index.html, right? Now we have this. Now let's see. So this particular point has been proven. Now let's see if we change, like when we change the name of the file here, and we kind of do this instead of HTML, we turn it to HTML. Let's see if it's still going to serve this particular content, right? So I'm going to rename that. To rename that, I'm going to use my mv command. I'm going to rename that so it will be var html. Now index, I'm going to call it htm, right? Now I'm pressing enter. Now if I run this and I'll see that I have index.htm, right? If I now curl, and you can see it's still same thing. It's still same thing. Now what if all three files are present, right? What if all three files are present? So what I'll do in this case now, is to create this same file. Now what I will now do is hello Sammy from index.html. Okay, still going to wrap this with h2. Okay, now call localhost. Now you can see hello Sammy from index.html. Now if I now remove this by using the rm command, this is just me basically manipulating our understanding. Now I call localhost. You can see hello Sammy, right, which is coming from index.html. Now if I remove this and then clear and then localhost, now I get the default, right? Cool. So now that particular part is understood. Now let's go to the next block here, which is the server name. Now the server name, when you're now using Nginx as a virtual host, yeah. So we actually now want to put in those domain names, yeah. But when you are not using as a virtual, meaning you're just hosting one website or one domain here, you can actually leave it as underscore. But when you are hosting multiple domain names, for convenience and for your future self, so you won't get confused, kindly come in here and just put in the domain name. So what you could do here is in place of, remember, let's say remember the name of this particular file now is default. So let's say instead of default we have the name here, which is sammykings.com. So I can come here, or I open this as read only, but then you can just delete this and write www.sammykings.com, then also put sammykings.com, so that anybody accessing your domain using www.sammykings.com, they could get here. And also when they don't put www, they just do like sammykings.com, they could also get here. All right, cool. Now the trial files here basically is telling us that, okay, how are we going to actually look for files? Now the first thing is actually going to do is that it's going to look for files in the URL. That is first going to look for files in the current URL. Then from the URL is now going to start looking for files in the folder present. Now if it doesn't see any particular file, it's then going to return a 404. Now I showed how to do this in the ELX review web server video. And I think, yeah, that is all, guys, for this particular video. Thank you, guys. I really want to thank you all for the views, for the likes, for the comments, and for your questions. Keep them coming. It enables us build a valid connection, and also enables me understand how best you are enjoying my content, and also tells me how best to also explain things to you guys so that you all can understand. Now before I actually stop the video, I actually want to specify the difference between doing Nginx restart and Nginx reload. Now when you do Nginx restart, what happens is that all connections is being dropped, and then this Nginx like reboots. That's what happens when you do a restart. Meaning, let's assume somebody is already connected to your particular machine. When you do Nginx restart, those connection is actually going to be dropped. This connection is actually going to be dropped automatically, and then Nginx will restart. That's what's called forceful shutdown. Now, sorry, that's what they call forceful restart, right? Now, if you want to actually handle this gracefully, it is advisable you just do Nginx reload. Now, when you do Nginx reload, what happens is that your worker process is still going to continue handling connection using the previously loaded configuration file that has been pushed to it by the master process. However, the master process is actually going to read up new configuration file that has been made and then pushes it now to the worker process. So no connection is being dropped off, right? Okay, so that's just what I wanted to add. Thank you guys for sticking through. Yeah, share this video, drop a like, hit the notification bell, and also hit the subscribe button. Thank you guys. Now in the next video we'll be talking about load balancers, and then we'll be building from here. Thank you guys. Do have a wonderful day.